So thank you very much for joining this virtual book launch. And I was just going to start us off. So Hunter and I have been working on this for most of our lives, it feels like. So back in, I suppose the original the original date when this was started as an embryonic project was back in 2014. Or even before that, actually. But so Hunter and I met at a conference in Liverpool that Joe organised, and we were both on a Spartacus panel and with Juliet Harrison. And I got Juliet and Hunter and my friend Sue Day to do this bizarre reading of this thread about how amazing Spartacus was going to be, and was a little bit risque. And we hadn't met before that, but we did that. Oh, it's Monica here, brilliant. And then I asked Hunter if she'd like to do a paper about violence in Spartacus at a conference at the Celtic conference in classics, which was going to be in Edinburgh in 2016. And we were just about the only reception paper in the whole conference. There was us and Justine Connell, who was doing something on post-colonial literature, and everyone else on our panel, and in fact in the whole conference, was doing much more straight classics. So I decided I'd go and talk to the organisers and say, you really need to have some reception and some popular culture in this. And so the idea of doing a panel on what we were calling ancient modern epic in 2016 was born. And sadly, Hunter couldn't make it, could you? But Dan and other people did. And it's looking at how the landscape has changed so much since 2014, when we were practically the only reception paper, and certainly the only ones on popular culture. And now, as to all the people working on it, it's just amazing and phenomenal. So the conference was 2016. We had lots of changes of the people on here. Some people on here were going to be in the book and weren't. Really sorry for those of you that were in the book, brilliant. And it probably was more than 50% new material by the time it got out in a month ago. And so it feels like a bit of an epic journey to getting the book made in the end. But it's been lovely working with Hunter, who is now a really great friend, as are a number of people on this call, great friends too. And looking forward to many more, hopefully not so long, epic journeys of the future for more conferences and more publications. So that was really what. So we wanted to celebrate the book, and I have my gin and tonic cup, and it is after 5 p.m. for me, so I'm okay. But you, of course, drinking, it's always after 5 o'clock or after 12 noon somewhere in the world, and so you can always have a drink if you want one. But what we really wanted to do was talk a little bit about the book very quickly, and we've got some of the we're going to talk about some of the chapters, and then we wanted to have a bit of a discussion about the future of epic, and Joe's going to start us off on that. So I'm now going to hand over to Hunter, who's going to say a little bit. So that was the inception of the project. Hunter's going to explain a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of it.
All right. So thank you, Amanda. And I guess everybody can hear me now. Yeah, so as Amanda suggested, the process from getting this, what started out as a stream or a panel at the CCC to this printed volume has been an epic one. We actually originally conceived of the project as sort of half pedagogy and epic papers, and then half epic in film and television, although the pedagogy papers still addressed a lot of contemporary media. Once we got the reader reports for it, we sort of realized that maybe the volume didn't cohere as we wanted it to, as well as we wanted it to. And in fact, this was a particular problem for me, because even though I didn't go to the original conference, I was going to write on that 2016 Netflix Roman Empire Reign of Blood, the docudrama about Commodus, and how effective this might be if you used it in a classroom setting. But once we got the reader reports, we decided to maybe try to focus the volume more on how epic, on the one hand, shows up in late 20th and early 21st century film, but how it's also increasingly showing up on the small screen. And that became the two halves of the volume as we have them today. And it also meant that I got to stop working on The Reign of Blood, which I wasn't particularly fond of anyway. And I got to spend a good deal of the pandemic lockdown rewatching all 8 seasons of Game of Thrones and writing on that instead. So our new lineup, I think we're very pleased with. After we revised our proposal and got new pieces, things moved fairly quickly. We did, as happens, we lost a few pieces along the way, picked up some, as Amanda mentioned, picked up a few authors. And I think we're really pleased with how things have turned out. The editing, working with Edinburgh University Press, they were very professional, turned around things very quickly, almost too quickly from time to time. But I have no complaints on that end. And so now I guess we'll turn things over. I did want to ask Monica, because she's one of the series editors, if she wanted to say a few words about, working with authors and just how the process flows from her perspective as a co-editor of the series. So Monica, are you there?
I'm here. You really want me to talk?
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Joe. Hi, Paula. It's great to see actual faces. It's fun to see you guys. I miss you guys so much. Let me put it back on gallery because I don't like speaker. Oh, no, I don't want to see myself. No, do I have to be spotlighted? Turn me off. Don't do that, host. Just let me just say really quickly that, Edinburgh, our series Screening Antiquity is still going. I don't know if I'd say going strong just because, pandemic sort of circumstances has slowed everybody down. When Hunter and Amanda, as they just described, the very long process to getting this book to the shape it is right now, this volume, it sort of coincided with a moment in our series, which I don't think was an unusual moment for us. It was happening with some other presses and other series as well, where there seemed to be a desire to move away from edited volumes and more towards monographs. And I do think that that's still the case, and that might be the case for some time. I mean, one of the reasons Lloyd and I started this series was so that we would have a venue to have collected editions, which I think are fun and, academically sound and pedagogically useful sometimes, right? You can use them for courses and so forth. So, and if you look at our list, right, we started in 2014. So it's not quite a decade yet, a short decade. And we have 10 books. 6 of them are edited collections, right, so far. So there are 2 more monographs coming out pretty shortly. 3 more, I guess. We just accepted another one by Lisa Maurice to start production. So we have done a lot of edited collections, and they do sell pretty well, some of them better than others. And we only have, out of those 10 that are in print, there's 4 monographs so far. But there does definitely seem to be a movement, perhaps not one that I fully agreed with, but I was outvoted by my co-editor, Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, and the new commissioning editor. So some of you may have met her or met her, Rachel Bridgewater, since Carol McDonnell stepped up to another position. So we're working with Rachel now. So if you do have a monograph idea, please let me know. I think Hunter and Amanda, I thank them for their comment that Edinburgh works very, very professionally, very quickly, very smoothly. Having just worked with Bloomsbury on the Troy Fall of a City volume, which was rejected by my own series. There you go. Don't start a series thinking you can publish whatever you want because, my own co-editor said he didn't want to publish it. So that's fine. Having just worked with Bloomsbury, I can say that Edinburgh is think a little bit more professional. I think Bloomsbury is just kind of trying to figure it out as they go along, and that's fine. They work quickly. They're delightful. I really like the look of the new book and everything, but I do think Edinburgh has the kind of the more, the university press kind of, gravitas or whatever. So, it just depends on what you're interested in. And I do think, it's great for us to have as many options as possible. But moving forward, I do think we're going to be looking at more monograph proposals rather than edited volumes. So if you want to come to the Troy Fall of the City session tomorrow, I'll talk more about the edited volume process at Bloomsbury, but that's it for now. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any questions about that. But we're thrilled to have this new book. It looks really cool. And hopefully it'll go up on the website soon.
Yeah, so the really good thing, we say holding it up, we've got a lovely dragon on the front, which is so good. As George R.R. Martin says, history is always better with dragons. So thank you. So what we were going to do is just spotlight on a few of the chapters that we've got kindly people here that are going to talk through what they're covering, and then we'll open up to general discussion. So I think we're handing over now to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about his chapter.
Sure, thanks guys, and I really appreciated this opportunity. So I had the first chapter in the book, which is unusual for me. I usually get put somewhere in the middle or at the end, but so I felt heightened responsibility to sort of kick things off. So what I talked about was 5 distinct but interdependent manifestations or projections, as I call them, of space in both ancient and screen epic. I view this as sort of a kind of fluid comparison. In that, if we talk about ancient epic, we can sort of see its relevance in screen epic, but I also think that screen epic has something to teach us about ancient epic as well. So, right, there's sort of a dialogue between the two. So I'll just run through the manifestations of space really quickly as I saw them. So first was the idea of epic as a massive genre. Most classicists are familiar with the whole kings and battles line, but we also know that epic has much more to offer than that, despite what Roman authors might have to say about it and the anxieties that they might produce about, say, women in the text. But screen epic embraces this kind of inclusivity very well, and so epic is really just sort of something for everyone, but running at a certain length to hold all of that content. Next projection deals with industry standards for epic, and in particular space. So on the screen, we're used to thinking of epic as a widescreen type of experience, right? Especially in the golden age of screen epic. With widescreen processes like Cinerama or Cinescope. And the standard on modern TVs and smartphones and computers, we now have a 16:9 aspect ratio. So widescreen is something we're used to. But I think that can create the kind of space to hold all of that content. And the ancient equivalent, I think, for me, is the dactylic hexameter, which is sort of the industry standard for epic, right? Aristotle calls that the sturdiest meter of all, and it was known that if you take a foot, just even 1 foot away from hexameter, suddenly it's not suitable for epic anymore, right? So there's no need to bulk up the hexameter; it's already bulky as it is. And so there's your sort of widescreen aspect ratio, but in terms of meter. Projection 3 is large scale space, so vistas, cityscapes, crowds. We're talking about spectacularity and the viewing of space, which the widescreen format gives a sort of frame to and directs our attention to various things. 4 would be global space. So you could call that world building if you want, but we're also talking just about the organization and compartmentalization of space within the epic text, whether it's an ancient text or a screen text. Then there's finally what I call genre space, which is kind of a return to number 1. It's not just theorizing epic as a grab bag of kings and battles and whatever else gets thrown into the text, but these kinds of motifs can get organized on the basis of literary kinds or genres. So there is elegiac space, for example. There's also tragic space, and elegy and tragedy are genres that originate from epic, but are now sort of returned to epic in a very self-conscious way. So what I did in the chapter was basically talk about examples of these kinds of projections in ancient and screen epic. And on the screen side, I looked at Troy, which is, of course, everybody's idea of a large epic Hollywood film. But it does have projections of elegiac space in it, which I thought was very interesting. And then I looked at the film Agara, which really is a kind of elegiac and mournful film, but does, through its projections of space, have pretensions to epic. And I guess in the end, where I end up is that no matter what epic aspires to be or whatever it contains, spatiality might be one of the stable criteria for judging whether something is epic or not. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So we were expecting Emma Stafford maybe to come along, but I haven't seen her on the attendee list. So maybe we will hand over to Jennifer, if that's all right.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to say I just had to rejoin the meeting via mobile hotspot because my power suddenly went out. So fingers crossed that I can stay with you guys. But I was going to say that my chapter is about the 2014 film Snowpiercer and the role that rumor plays in the plot. And I compared it to Virgilian concepts of rumor in the Aeneid. And I will say at the outset that when I was telling science fiction scholar Terry Harpold about this project, because he also works on Snowpiercer, his first question to me was, how can Snowpiercer be epic? All the action takes place on a train. And to which I jokingly pointed out, well, the train circumnavigates the globe, Terry. But of course, I do want to talk about, like, you know, what makes this epic. So for those of you not familiar with the film, Snowpiercer is about a group of people on a train attempting to escape the ruins of their frozen civilization with a leader. And of course, the Aeneid is an epic about a group of people attempting to escape the burning ruins of their city. Both the film and Virgil's ancient epic ask audiences to consider unsettling questions about their society's futures. Number one, how do rumors and fate contribute to the sense that there's no opting out of the future in either work? And number two, are strife and conflict necessary in order to achieve a peaceful society? Moreover, I would argue that both works contain very problematic endings because they ask their audience to consider, what will life look like following war and destruction? In the Aeneid, of course, the audience is viewing the events from the vantage point of knowing the future, but in Snowpiercer, of course, the audience does not know the outcome of events. So I focused on rumor in both works. The film's main character, Curtis Everett, is told that he is fated to lead the people who ride on the Snowpiercer train. And he starts a revolution to get to the front of the train so he can overthrow the class system that rules the train. Like Aeneas, Curtis is going to hesitate sometimes. He's going to have a father figure to guide him. And rumor is going to drive the action of the story. And rumors are going to help shape Curtis's conviction that he needs to lead a rebellion. And of course, when he finds out that he's been convinced to lead the rebellion to help control the train's population, he's going to opt out of his future as the train's new leader. Now, what makes this epic to me is that once we enter this phase of the film, we're starting a whole question about whether or not it's easier to imagine the end of the world as we know it or the end of the system as we know it. And can we move beyond a binary worldview? So what you really see by the end, I argue, is that we're looking at what Jerry Kahneman calls a non-white, non-Western, non-capitalist future as a possibility. The film has a very ambiguous ending, much like the Aeneid does in many ways. And, you know, when you look at, is Aeneas civilization destroyer or civilization builder, you can also ask the same thing about Curtis Everett. Both Curtis and Aeneas have been told that their destiny awaits them. Curtis thinks that he is overthrowing a corrupt system, only to be told that he is now the corrupt system's new leader. And Snowpiercer's global warming parable, I argue, shows us epic's future, anxiety about a dystopian world that may already be inevitable. And both Aeneas and Curtis, of course, I argue, struggle to come to terms with their future as events are manipulated around them to encourage their acceptance of their destiny. So Aeneas's shield suggests the never-ending war machine will be Rome's future, just as the future for humans offered in Snowpiercer is the never-ending train engine. But both Turnus's death in the Aeneid and Curtis's decision to stop the Snowpiercer train compel audiences to think about the consequences of life after devastation and war. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And now we're going back to Monica, who's going to talk about Thermo Romo.
I'm not going to keep the chair here because I already talked. I just want to follow up on what both Dan and Jennifer said, that it's really exciting to sort of write about the different ways epic sort of struggles against its conservative nature and tries to do some innovative things. I really enjoyed Snowpiercer, and I loved your reading of it too, Jennifer. So yeah, so I was looking at the film Thermae Romae, which many of you have seen and really enjoy. I'd like to start teaching it pretty soon. If anyone has any tips about that, let me know. But yeah, there's many angles to take on this film. Natalie's going to write about it soon as well. And I sort of just stayed in that framework of, what does epic do? What does the epic genre force onto stories? And then what do stories, struggle to do to become innovative and different within different geographic and cultural contexts? So yeah, so looking at Thermae Romae as an ancient Roman story told by Japanese artists about their own history of empire, which is both, sort of problematic, but also something that they wanted to celebrate, not really covertly, but at least in a comic way to sort of deal with some of the painful memories of Japanese imperial aggression. So it's an interesting thing to read against, the mid-century American films, for example, that we all have written about and taught about. So anyway, I really loved writing about it. Would love to be part of a project of sort of larger sort of Asian receptions, Asian and Asian American and Asian Anglo-Asian and all kinds of sort of new cultural outlooks there. So let me know if anyone's working on any projects.
Cool. Actually, I'm doing something on museum manga at the moment, and so I will reach out when I get around to it. I need to get on with it. I think I've got a deadline in February for this chapter, so I really do need to get on with it. So I'll definitely reach out, and I'll be talking to Natalie about it, of course. So now we're moving on to Kirsten and Helen and the horse.
Okay. Thank you, and thanks for letting me in as a late add-on to the volume. It was really fun. So in my article, first I argued that the ancient audience would have seen a clear relationship between Helen of Troy and the Trojan horse, a clearer relationship than would be immediately obvious to a more modern audience. And I kind of base this on references in ancient poetry that associate women in general with horses, and then some that associate Helen herself with horses, as well as a little bit of other evidence from vase painting and things like that, as well as the female gendering of the horse itself in ancient literature, and also the explicitly tricky nature of both Helen and the horse, which the tricky nature of both of them are juxtaposed in Odyssey 4 by the tale that Menelaus tells about her making the deceptive, trying to change her voice to trick the people in the horse to betraying themselves, but also seen through the lens of Pandora, in the position of both Helen and the horse as sort of bookends of the war, of the Trojan War. So with that kind of grounding, then I turn to cinematic depictions of Helen of Troy and the Trojan War. And I look at the way that in these films, the horse, again, is gendered female more visually than in terms of wording. And then I look at thematic connections between Helen and the horse in films, including Mark Algarat's The Loves of the Three Queens, and Robert Wise's Helen of Troy, both from 1954, Giorgio Ferroni's The Trojan Horse, the 2003 Helen of Troy miniseries by John Kent Harrison, Wolfgang Petersen's Troy, and then Troy Fall of a City. So I kind of look at different ways in which there are visual connections made between Helen and the horse. And unfortunately, Amanda and Hunter wouldn't let me have 500 pictures to show those, but they did give me 2. So that was good. So through costuming and hair, so I kind of tried to describe some of those verbally rather than showing them visually, but also through things like camera movement and thematic connections between the two, and just through explicit association with horses themselves in some cases. So in very different ways, these filmic versions kind of replicate the connections between Helen and the horse that were done in different ways in Antiquity. And in the end, I kind of argue that this sort of demonstrates the persistence of the tricky, animalistic, destructive nature of women, that kind of idea persists into our modern world, despite our idea that we're much more progressive and things like that. And it's interesting to me, I didn't put this in the article explicitly, and perhaps I should have, but these connections seem to be a lot more intense in the more recent works, like Troy Fall of a City and Troy and the USA miniseries, which is interesting because we think of ourselves as so much more progressive now than like in the 1954 versions. But maybe it occurs to me that that's because those misogynistic kind of thoughts were so much more overt at the time. And now that we're repressing them, they're coming out in these other, like, more nefarious, more subtle ways that we have to kind of analyze a bit. But anyway, that's it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kirsten. And now we're going to move to our illustrious president, Meredith, to talk about her chapter on Battlestar Galactica.
Hey, everybody. So I was one of the people who was working explicitly on television as opposed to on film. And, I got interested in Battlestar Galactica because, as a number of people have kind of casually noticed, it seems a lot like the Aeneid. And I would point out that, Corinne Pash had written a column about this in Classical Outlook, and Charlotte Higgins had written a blog post in The Guardian. So I always cite them as the first two people, I think, who put it out there as such. And I'm actually one of the people who's teed up to publish a monograph in Monica and Lloyd's series in Screening Antiquity on kind of like the broader outlook of Battlestar Galactica as not only a reception of the Aeneid, but specifically an American reception of the Aeneid. And as many people know, Battlestar Galactica is so explicitly tied to 9/11 and the American response to it and the post 9/11 responses that followed in the War on Terror. So, this is kind of like the broader scope of how I feel like Epic is not only has this kind of transmedial resonance that Joanna Paul, outlines in her monograph that we all took inspiration from, but to also talk about it as what's become a transhistorical phenomenon where, how do we feel epic? How do we feel epic now? And in my chapter in Amanda and Hunter's volume focuses only on one small slice of that. It's titled The Gods in Epic Television, kind of riffing off my dissertation advisor, Dennis Feeney's book title, The Gods in Epic. But it's focused on the Homeric cosmos in Battlestar Galactica, and really specifically on how the roles that are assigned to the Olympian gods that we're familiar with from, taking the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid as the three kind of Homeric epics that most concern me. What's all kind of packaged together in Homeric epic gets kind of refracted in the case of Battlestar Galactica, where I see three different roles that the Olympian gods need to play in the Homeric world. One is as the focal point of worship and all kinds of requests by humans who take their existence on faith, and that we in the audience always have a privileged perspective on the reality or existence of the gods, but that's something that the human characters don't actually enjoy. They just have to assume it. And so it's about how humans relate to the gods. Then, of course, we have the gods' operations amongst themselves as a divine society, which, again, we as audience members spend a lot of time with, but, humans are not privy to. But that's where we also learn about all their different kind of powers and characteristics. And then thirdly, the Olympians, and especially Zeus above all, but not only Zeus, have a vested interest in maintaining what we kind of collectively refer to as fate. That, it's understood, I think, that part of the gods' mastery over the cosmos is their knowledge of the future. And if certain things don't happen, I assume, that their ability to know the future would also be compromised because things would certainly not line up. And of course, Zeus's whole rule, according to Hesiod, is predicated on a certain way of ruling, which is different than his predecessors, which is also bound up with the stability of the cosmos, because all the players have to cooperate in some way in order to achieve desired outcomes. So I looked at Battlestar Galactica's engagement in refracting these three roles onto different characters within the BSG cosmos. So there's the Lords of Kobol, who are the clearest analog to the Olympians as the focal point of human worship. Then there are the humanoid Cylons, the kind of the new models that have many of the same kind of powers that we associate with the Homeric gods, and also operate amongst themselves as a society that considers each other siblings in some meaningful sense, but also a kind of council that needs to agree and then catastrophically falls out, as we see in the Iliad also happening and taking two sides in the cosmic war. And then thirdly, how you have these kind of what are latterly referred to as messengers, or sometimes angels, characters who appear in the guise primarily of the Cylon Six, and then also as Gaius Baltar in the later part of the series, who take the appearance of people who are known friends to certain characters, who are able to maneuver them, sometimes very violently, in the case of the kind of Six avatar, into things that need to happen in order to achieve the outcome that is desired by the kind of overall power, which is never named, and in fact rejects even the title of God, we are told, in trying to achieve some kind of grander cosmic outcome, which is constructive for humans as well as for Cylons and these other kind of, cosmic figures. And it did seem to me that, what is epic without that sense of cosmos, that like the grandeur of scope? And certainly science fiction, to which Battlestar Galactica obviously belongs also in terms of its generic identity, has that fascination with the sense of what lies beyond, what's beyond the human ken or beyond, human power. Even though sometimes it seems like there's a tension between kind of religious faith and, the tenets of science fiction, there are clearly places and texts where these two things merge. And I feel like Battlestar Galactica, with its very humanistic interests, is very much one of those texts. So that's how I framed it as, really appropriate for thinking about in terms of not just kind of epic broadly writ, but really Homeric epic specifically. So thanks.
Oh, thank you, Meredith, and so great that you've mentioned how Joe Paul's book was really an inspiration to us all, because we, following on from Joe's exploration of epic in film, we felt that this was kind of taking on her work. So we were very pleased when Joe agreed to do the afterword, and so Joe's going to say going to spend a couple of minutes talking about that, and then he's going to kindly start us in our broader discussion.
Thanks, Amanda. And yeah, I just wanted to start really by saying congratulations to you, Amanda and Hunter, for getting the volume out. It really is fantastic and great to see. And from my end of things, it didn't look like a really long, painful journey at all, but I know that can sometimes be the case for editors. And yeah, since I'm on the other side of the pond where it is firmly dark, then I'm also joining you in a beverage to wish you congratulations. So it's not just you, Amanda. Yeah, so you were kind of reflecting on the long journey that you all took in conceiving of this project and pulling the volume together, which sort of got me just thinking actually about what my own journey was in initiating some of the questions that are at stake here. And I realized with absolute kind of sinking horror that it's 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was 2 months into a PhD where I was starting to think about this kind of fundamental question of the kind of elevator pitch that I always gave to people when they asked what my doctoral thesis was about, was that it was addressing this question essentially of why some films are called epic, and trying to explore the notion that there must be more to it than just the kind of the industry application of the label, meaning something of great kind of size and spectacle, and trying to unpack the relationship that epic cinema might have had to the ancient epic tradition. So yeah, with that project seeming sort of so long ago now in so many ways, and you know, in other ways as well, feeling like it belongs to a previous life of mine, it's so gratifying and kind of stimulating and nice to see that some of those questions that I was starting to ask, because I definitely don't think I did answer them necessarily, that some of those questions kind of were thought-provoking enough to stimulate future projects and research, and you know, to see that coming into fruition with this volume. So it was a real honor to be asked to write the afterword. What that forced me to do, although I think this is something that was probably on my mind anyway, you know, even probably before I finished the monograph that was based on my thesis, because I guess this is something that happens to lots of us with research projects. You know, we quite quickly fall out of love with them, or see the flaws in them, see the things that they were failing to do. I think for quite some time now, I've had a really clear sense of just how partial my examination of the topic was in film in the classical epic tradition. There was so much that it didn't cover, and that was, you know, a necessary part of the design of a PhD thesis in a book. Of course, it can't cover everything. But, you know, even as I was writing it, and especially in the aftermath, I've been so conscious of, you know, all the areas that it didn't look at, and television probably first and foremost among that. I think I only really had an inkling at the time of how actually cinema needed to be considered alongside television if I was looking for ways in which the ancient genre of epic maintained a kind of vitality and a presence and a life after antiquity and into contemporary popular culture. Then yeah, this idea that television had to be first and foremost among the considerations for that was something that was very much at the edges of my vision at the time. But I think what you've all done, or many of you, you know, who've squarely focused on television in this volume, you know, has shown how front and center that needs to be. And actually, you know, perhaps in my defense, I think that is partly because the landscape of what television looks like as a cultural form and as an object of study has already changed hugely in the 20 years since I began the project. So, you know, it's absolutely right that that's now getting proper consideration. I didn't have time or space to think beyond a kind of an ancient world setting particularly. And again, I think what so many of the contributions to this volume have done is to broaden the scope, to think about science fiction in particular, which again was kind of on the edges of my consideration at the time, but you know, I think has proven to be such a fertile ground for thinking about that ongoing life of epic in popular culture. And I think as well, you know, one real shortcoming of my work that I've always been really conscious of is that it doesn't sufficiently get to grips with, let's say, some of the more problematic aspects of thinking about how ancient forms and ideas and genres persist into the modern world. It really only very briefly touches on questions of, you know, the sort of political implications and the politicization of epic. It really doesn't do hardly anything at all with thinking about issues of globalism or representation of different race and ethnicities and gender identities, you know, and all of us kind of working within the field of classical studies and the arts and humanities more broadly now compared to 20 years ago, I think are so much more conscious of how urgent, especially in classical reception studies, I think it is to give proper consideration to all of that side of things, which wasn't something I did well at all. But again, I'm glad that it's emerging in lots of the essays in this volume. So those were all things that I think I didn't do, and that I'm glad to see, you know, people kind of picked up the baton and kind of ran with it in really helpful ways. in order to kind of kick off a little bit of discussion, because it would be so interesting to hear what people think about some of these bigger issues. A couple of things that I think were, sort of lurking themes that were important to me when I was exploring the afterlife of epic in film in particular, and which I think really have been expanded upon usefully in the volume. And I don't want to draw attention to individual contributions, but I think these are themes that run through a number of the essays. It struck me a lot at the time that I was writing my book, and I think it becomes ever more pressing to think about this, especially in the kind of circumstances that we all find ourselves in today, which is to think about what we might call the social function of epic as a notion, and how cinema and TV and other popular cultural forms help to kind of extend the social function that we all understand epic had within antiquity, and to think about how that might be playing out in similar or different ways today. So for me, one of my key defining features in understanding epic was always to think about it as a social, a collective medium, a platform for identity forming, for collective storytelling and myth making in ways that reach far beyond kind of individual interests. And I think as we find ourselves in a world where all of the kind of certainties that we had, certainly about cinema as a kind of a collective activity, have sort of, the rug's been pulled out from under us with the pandemic there. But of course, there are different ways in which our viewing habits might have sort of filled in some of the gaps and helped to provide a kind of cohesion and a unity around things, just in different ways. And I'm really interested to keep thinking about how epic plays a role there. And I think also, something that perhaps didn't emerge particularly in my work, but I can see it coming through in some of the essays here, is to think perhaps even going beyond cinema and television to look at other screen media like video games and all sorts of other potential innovations too, thinking about how epic connects to ideas of virtual reality and immersivity. So I find that fascinating for all sorts of aspects of receptions of antiquity. It comes up for me as a theme very often. And in the context of thinking about epic, I find it particularly fascinating, I think, because for me, again, another sort of founding principle of epic that I often found myself working with was this idea that epic is a medium that necessarily depends on a certain kind of distancing. That was one of the justifications that I had for focusing particularly on ancient world settings. But as I argued at the time, it also helps us to apply epic to science fiction. This idea that an epic narrative is very often something set at some distance from ourselves. But I wonder if that's not something that we can sort of put a bit of pressure on, especially, because immersivity is a bit of a buzzword in media studies more broadly, sort of thinking about contemporary forms at the moment. And yeah, I'd be interested to know what people think about the potential for notions of immersivity to kind of feed into how we understand epic in contemporary popular culture. So I'll end there because I know that Amanda and Hunter wanted to have a little bit of time for discussion. So I don't know whether you're just going to throw the floor open, Amanda, but I'll hand back to you to sort of steward this last bit. But thank you for having me.
No, well, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for your participation and for your contribution to the book. And everybody go and get your libraries to buy the book. And then when it comes out in paperback, then you can probably afford to go and buy one as well. So one of the problems with academic publishing and costs. So I'd just like to throw it open really for 15 minutes. I think immersivity was something Hunter and I discussed. And earlier in the year, I went to the War of the Worlds immersive experience in London, and it blew my mind actually. And so you can actually go on a boat trip on the Thames, you could go up in a balloon. I wanted to go and do the whole thing again after coming out of it, but it was, I don't know how many other people have done this, but it was a series that there were actors, and you went into a series of very small scale pieces and then into very large scale using the VR headsets. And of course, this was science fiction, Victorian London science fiction, but I really saw the possibilities for making this, the ancient world in this kind of medium would be amazing. And the idea of the small scale and the large scale, of course, comes out in Epic very much too. So it did feel as though it could work for ancient world Epic, and felt very epic to me. So I just want to open it to the floor then now. So what's everybody got to say? The future of Epic. Do you want to hold your hand up or
the social function of Epic too, I think was another interesting point that
definitely
raised. Yeah.
Nobody's now going to say anything, are they? Yeah, and people have just said, so Emma, welcome. You must have been caught up in something. We thought we'd better get to discussion, but maybe you want to open the discussion, or maybe not. Up to you.
Is that my punishment for being late? Yes, many apologies. I'm in the middle of trying to move an elderly mother from one side of the country to the other, and it's complicated. But hello, everybody. Nice to see you. I guess because this was rather the burden of my contribution to the book, I really was thinking a lot about, and because of lockdown as well, a lot about the series, the 8-part series or what have you, as opposed to the 2-hour film, as a medium for the any kind of modern ideas of Epic. I really like what people have just been saying about immersivity as well, but just sort of feeling that there seems to have been a bit of a sort of general shift towards longer, slower playing out of stories, but I just kind of felt like something that we kind of need to that I want to keep an eye on, and see how far that really goes, because as we'll be talking about tomorrow at the other book launch, obviously that was something very distinctive about Troy Fall of a City, was that for once was looking at the 8-part series rather than the one-off film, but so many things now are being repackaged and represented to us by Netflix or whoever as a series rather than a film. I was thinking of things like The Handmaid's Tale, and all those different things that once upon a time were shorter and fatter, and now have got longer and thinner, if that makes any sense. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think TJ's got his hand up. Would you like to ask us a question or bring a contribution?
I was saying it's one of those more of a comment than a question, for which I apologize. But we're all academics, we know this. So I just want to piggyback on that comment about television, and then I want to talk a little bit about superheroes, because I think that that's also where the Epic is coming to live. So what interests me about television is its scope, or temporal scope, let's put it that way. Like, if we're thinking about Epic as being something as a genre or a sensibility that's about time, and Vivian Sobchak in her essay talks about how part of what gives Epic cinema its kind of phenomenological punch is that you have to sit through 2.5 to 3.5 hours. But how does television change that? Because it's both smaller spatially, even our big screen TVs can't match what is available on the big cinema screen, but it's drawn out in time. So there's kind of an interesting conflict there in terms of television in particular, where Epic seems to have gone to live, at least Epic in terms of Antiquity. But there's also the superhero phenomenon, which has come to sort of occupy, at least in theatrical terms, the kind of terrain that was once occupied by biblical epics in the mid-century period. I mean, in the mid-century period, it was the 10 Commandments or, Ben-Hur or Spartacus that drew everyone to the cinema. Like, that was their purpose, industrially speaking, because they could offer a pleasure that television could not. And now that space is occupied by superhero films. I'm going to see Spider-Man today, later this evening. And so it's also true that these kind of cosmological conflicts that were so much part of the mid-century Epic are also now occupied by superhero films. And that's, I think, part of the reason that they are so popular. It's not just a visual stimulant, but also because they fulfill that cultural function as well. So I guess there's a lot going on there. That's what happens when I'm over caffeinated. And I love talking about epic. So I don't know if you guys want to pick up that or not, but those were just some of the things that were percolating as I was listening to this conversation.
Yeah, really interesting. And we haven't, so Hunter and I haven't really talked about superheroes, even though now it gives me the opportunity. I'm sorry, I'm really going to annoy people. So some of you will have already seen this. This is my Wonder Woman who gives us advice. Natalie's laughing again. So Wonder Woman, this was my Secret Santa present from a friend, and she gives you advice. Well, that isn't very good advice, is it? I'm Wonder Woman. We kind of know that. I am a warrior, so we can all be warriors. And sorry, I'm being really irritating doing that. Roger's now thinking, how is she doing this again? So I just needed to get that in. So I think the next hand up, though, think on the time. So we'll think more about superheroes, and I'm sure there's more to talk about there. But thank you for that. I think Chris was next with his hand up.
Thank you. This is a really wonderful presentation. Thank you. I just want to sort of piggyback on what TJ is saying, but also to ask a question about, Dan's idea of spatiality as a defining element of epic. But because it seems to me that, so much of the viewing experience now is small screen, I've had the experience, I don't know if you have, I was watching Brokeback Mountain on a phone, and I thought to myself, it's these vast wildernesses, but it's like on a screen like this big. And, do people just, do we have any sense of how people consume that? They know that, do they just like sort of, like supply the big screen experience? And I wonder whether or not the fact that it's solitary actually sort of increases that or not, because I have to say one of the most alienating experiences is going to see a big budget film, like one of those big screen, and there only being 3 people in the cinema. It seems like it's such a letdown. I don't know. Again, like TJ's points, those are things to sort of ruminate on rather than to perhaps directly answer. But thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and has gaming become the world where I'm just thinking about, I think my husband's just turned up home and the person's going to be coming to look around the house in a minute, but he games with people all over the world and has about 5 screens in his man cave. And actually that's the communal spirit that we're not getting because we watch TV on the big screen at home rather than in the cinema. So maybe the social element of Epic has shifted, and I have nothing that I can say really about that. I'll maybe ask him about it later. So go on, Dan.
Well, I just wanted to respond to Chris really quickly. The idea of immersivity, I think, has shifted in terms of what the shows are demanding of our attention, right? Because you have that sort of segmented idea of a show now that can go on for years and years and years. And, that the kind of encyclopedic knowledge or the kind of close reading you have to do just to view it. So that might compensate for the smaller screen experience. And then there's also just the idea of viewing communities. Thanks to the internet, we all kind of know what each other are watching and what we're doing and how we can react to things. So there is a way of having that kind of communal experience that might even be more powerful and more personal than what you might get by sitting in a room full of strangers, no matter how engaged they might be.
Because actually you're interacting with them rather than just sitting there. And so maybe that is the communal experience. Thanks, Dan, really helpful. Right, I'm conscious of the time, so I think the next person, I'm so sorry, how do I pronounce it? It's Cohen?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Koen actually, but
Koen, okay.
it's impossible in English. So no, I was really intrigued by the comment about superheroes. So my PhD, I'm writing my PhD actually about Epic in Star Wars and superhero franchises. And for those of you who were with at the panel this morning, may have heard my comments about the transmedia landscape. But I get the sense that one of the defining features of modern pop culture is it is organization in these transmedia franchises where you have like the Avengers or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, and they have these kind of core stories like the Star Wars films or the Lord of the Rings films or the books or Harry Potter, the same. But you find they are then expanded in these other media. And interestingly, at least I get the sense that somehow the film elements mostly, or sometimes the series, but often it's still the films which kind of are the main attraction and form kind of the central node in this transmedia hub, where then the series or video games or whatever explore kind of these side stories. So what we did this morning is also make this kind of comparison between how Epic in Antiquity functioned as this kind of node in a well, what we might call an ancient transmedia landscape with tragedy, etc. But I think it's interesting that still kind of film remains somehow privileged as this kind of main attraction. Like a new Avengers movie is really putting this, moving the story forward, whereas the series kind of generally explore like the side quests, to put it in video game terms.
Yeah.
Okay, well, no, thank you. And I definitely think it'd be great to talk about this afterwards. And Natalie, shall I plug again for our, if anybody wants to, if anybody would like to do anything about Wonder Woman, please look out for the call for papers that went out earlier this week. So Natalie and I are looking at doing a virtual conference on Wonder Woman. So you might be interested in that, Kim. That would be amazing. Right. So I think the next hand up was Paula. And so Meredith, I think you were going to talk, but are you? Oh God, my phone's ringing now. Right,
No, don't worry about it. I was going to address something that actually Chris brought up about, like, you know, what is big and what is a, you know, what is a viewing screen for any medium anymore anyway now, because now it's all in the hands of the user. So I'm done.
Hey, I'm really going to have to go because somebody wants to come and look around my house that I'm trying to sell. So I'm so sorry, but lovely to see everybody. Please send me a message and read the book. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
So go ahead, Paula, and then I guess we probably need to wrap it up after that, but sure.
Well, it was a bit like, can you hear me okay? It was a bit like Meredith's comment, really, because I thought about the dialectic between form and content. I've just come back from an afternoon quiet lunchtime screening at our local cinema of West Side Story, and there are some movies I couldn't possibly watch on the TV, however big the screen. And it's partly the collective experience. But I always feel with epics, you see, I wouldn't ever watch Lawrence of Arabia on anything other than the cinema. So it's just striking me that, you know, people were worried that there was an epic prose romance, which my PhD was actually on, Apuleius's Golden Ass or Metamorphoses. So I'm thinking about mismatches between form and content when people are expecting a big screen for epic. And so it's a little bit like Meredith's comment, actually.
Certainly, yeah. And it does seem now that the viewer has so much more control over that experience. I was just thinking about how watching Succession recently, I sort of watch it while texting with a friend, and if a reference to the Roman Empire pops up, we'll pause it and kind of go back and quote it, and you know, you just can get to know the dialogue and the ins and outs so much more intricately. I mean, I guess with the VHS in the 80s and 90s, we started that process of being able to sort of freeze and go back and, you know, quote and overquote, but now we're getting even more, I think, involved in these series that as they sort of unfold, and television, of course, but I mean, and films at home as well. But with our you know, viewing at home has gotten even more spectacular as well, with sound bars and increasingly large flat screen televisions. But so anyone else? I think, and to keep on track, we should probably wind up anyway. But thanks everybody for coming and you know, reminding us of your excellent contributions, and thanks for the questions.